Hello, I'm Marnie Downing and I'm here to talk to you about FERPA. FERPA is the Family and Educational Rights and Privacy Act that was passed in 1974. FERPA provides the right of parents and adult-age students to inspect and receive a copy of student records, the right to deny access to others, specifically those outside the school system, with some exceptions, and we will be discussing those exceptions further in this presentation. It also covers a process to correct errors, including a hearing, the right to opt out of military recruitment, the right to opt out of the disclosure of students' directory information, and a compliant process handled by the Family Compliance Office of the United States Department of Education. There are some things that FERPA does not cover. It does not give individuals the right to sue the school. Only the U.S. Department of Education can sanction schools that have violated FERPA. It puts a burden on the student and the parents to respond to opt-out opportunities, such as the disclosure of directory information. It does not dictate requirements for the safeguarding of educational records. So who must comply with FERPA? All schools that receive funds from the U.S. Department of Education, firstly, public and elementary and secondary schools, also college and universities, either public or private, whose students receive financial aid from the federal government. So what is FPCO? FERPA is administered by the Family Policy Compliance Office in the Department of Education. The FPCO's website provides guidance on various aspects of FERPA to students, parents, teachers, and school administrators. I've included this website. It also gives you quite a bit of information because there is a lot of information dealing with FERPA and very many specific cases that we won't be covering in all the topics today. The next part is educational records. Educational records consist of anything directly related to a student that is maintained by an educational agency, institution, or third-party vendor. I will not read through all of these today. I'm quite sure that you can read them for yourself. But the most thing that we need to remember about educational records is it really considers anything that can personally identify a particular student, whether it's their social security number, their grades, their attendance records, their immunization records, their date of birth, those or who their parents are. Those are things that can definitely tell you that these particular records are speaking about a specific student. So what is not part of an educational record? Records of teacher and administrators that are kept in their sole possession. Those may be anecdotal notes that a teacher may be keeping on a specific student, and also with administrators. Records of law enforcement unit of the educational institution solely for law enforcement reasons. We don't necessarily see that in Buckland because we don't have an SRO officer, but there are very specific guidelines dealing with SRO officers in FERPA, and that is seen in much larger schools than ours. The personal records of those individuals employed by the educational institution, those actually would fall under what is HIPAA, which is a different law. Alumni records, records of homeschooled students. So what is the difference between direct observation and a written record? Well, it says FERPA does not prohibit a school official from disclosing information he or she witnessed or overheard to the appropriate authorities. So if you're a teacher and you see two children get into a physical altercation, then the administrators feel that they need to call in law enforcement, you're more than welcome to discuss that with law enforcement. However, if you are an administrator and then you choose to write down your direct observation, then it becomes part of a written record. and written records are then covered by FERPA, because then you can be used to identify that specific student. Another topic I wanted to cover at this time is students with disabilities are also covered by IDEA and have additional confidentiality. So if that's something that you're concerned about, definitely discuss that with your administrator or the special education teacher who happens to cover your grade in our building. Now let's talk about personally identifiable information. That is information that alone or in combination would greatly allow a person in the school community to identify a student with reasonable certainty. So, FERPA prohibits the release of personally identifiable information contained in a student's educational record unless it's directory information. We have discussed that previously. This sometimes becomes a little challenging for us in Buckland. We don't have that many students, so it's easy to obviously identify. But we do have very strict policies on making sure that we're covering FERPA, and we will discuss that later. So what is the directory information? It is personally identifiable information that is considered not harmful if it's shared. FERPA allows schools to disclose PII without consent, provided the school has given public notice to the families. The best case to discuss what a directory information would be is information that we would send to other schools, especially when we're dealing with athletic events. When we go to a basketball game and all of our basketball players are announced, how old they are, how tall they are, what their name is, and whether they're a senior or junior or so on. You would also maybe include weight and height in activities if we had, say, wrestling, for instance. I will let you read over that information. So some things that they also are talking about. There are some times that a school can disclose educational records without appropriate consent, but it would be due to an emergency, such as an impending natural disaster, a terrorist attack, a campus threat, or the outbreak of an epidemic disease. However, the release of that information is only allowed for the duration of the emergency and does not allow for a blank release of every student's personal information. And obviously that would be needed to know who our students are, what grades they're in, especially if we had, say, a tornado. We would definitely need to know who was in what grade, who they are, who their parents are, and their contact information. Also, FERPA permits school districts to disclose information in compliance with judicial order or lawfully issued subpoena, although it is subject to the need to notify the parent in order for the parent to obtain a protective order, especially when you're dealing with children who are minors, and in the connection with a student engaged in a crime of violence or sex offense. Okay, these are two pieces of information that I think that are important that we discuss. We don't have a large Hispanic population in our school, but there is a large Hispanic population in our state, and so that could change over time. So let's discuss the first piece of information. In Pyler versus Doe, the U.S. Supreme Court held that a state may not deny access to public education to any child residing in the state, regardless of whether the child is present in this country legally or illegally. Thus, the undocumented or non-citizen status of a student or his or her parents is irrelevant to the student's entitlement to public education. This also goes in with ICE officers. Can only access student records should be allowed if the requesting agency has a valid court order or subpoena in compliance with FERPA or immigration laws or regulations. So what does this mean for FERPA in our classroom? Well, as a teacher, you may not be dealing with all of this information all of the time. Don't necessarily deal with inputting student records into a computer. You're giving grades and teaching your kids. So the first thing we need to look at is be careful with technology. Don't use websites that require your students to enter personal information unless it has been approved by a supervisor or your school's technology officer. Many websites, especially free ones, are selling off that personal information, and that's how they keep their free status. Secondly, find out what companies or vendors your school is either working with or feels comfortable working with, and continue to evaluate that technology that you and your students utilize. Keep all student data safe. Store students' data in a secure location. So, don't email information to unverified parent email or address. Sometimes this happens accidentally because you could accidentally giving information to family members that are not allowed to have it. You need to keep any physically graded materials or grade books in a secure and safe place. And don't discuss student information with others unless that person has a legitimate educational goal. So, responding to access requests. You may communicate your educational record information with parents, but you need to make sure that you're talking to the legal guardian, because sometimes some of our parents aren't legal guardians. Sometimes that legal guardian could be their grandmother or their aunt. Also, if you receive a request to inspect or review educational records that you don't have access to, it's best to go through your administration before you necessarily hand them over the school file to that particular parent. Next thing we're going to talk about is data destruction. FERPA does not provide specific requirements for the destruction of educational records. However, there are some things to use for good practice. So written materials should really be shredded. If you decide to keep paper grades, those things should be shredded after a certain amount of time. Electronic data is much more challenging to destroy. That's something that you would need to talk to our tech guys about, how necessarily to destroy that. And lastly is third-party companies. We need to be very careful. The basis of their business could be to sell the private information to others. So we need to be very careful about how we choose to destroy that data, and if we choose to use the cloud, on how that cloud is necessarily monitored, and how safe is our educational records. The next thing that I thought you need to know, students with an IEP have specific rights under IDEA. Please see the special education teacher about destruction of special education materials. Now, I'm not talking about the graded papers. Those aren't any different than any of your other students. But say that you have a special educator, like myself, who gives you information about who their pair is going to be and how much time they have in the classroom, if they have any accommodations. Those pieces of paper are confidential, should not be shared, should not be posted in your classroom, and should be destroyed. So if you don't want to shred them to yourself, please give them back to the special education teacher that provides service for your grade. So our master policy book for Buckland schools, that was actually updated in 2018 by the Kansas Association of School Boards. The policy regarding FERPA are very thorough and complete. The student policy begins on IDAE. The policy on release of student records begins on JRB. It would be nice. One thing about the policy book is it's very large. It's housed in our superintendent's office, but it is very complete on how we handle data, student data that we either create or we get from their parents. So secondly, students' IEP records in our district are managed by their current special educator. And we do keep our master files in our district. We keep them in-house. And those files are housed in room 203. So for any reason that you would like to see them, then a special education teacher can look at them with you. We cannot provide copies to you. We can, so that's a whole other IDEA, and now I'm deviating from FERPA. So, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I know can be a little lengthy, and FERPA can be a lot of information, and hopefully I stayed out of the weeds. So the next few pages are my references that I used for this presentation. So there are some that are some great information, especially the one that I listed in the presentation itself to give you more information on FERPA. So thanks again for your time. Have a great day.